Good afternoon, everyone. It's now 10 to 3 and this hearing session is open. This hearing session is in relation to the independent examination of Winchester District Local Plan 2020-2040. Can I introduce Jill Taylor? She's the programme officer. Many of you will have been in touch with her already. If you've got any queries about the administration of the examination, please have a word with her or contact her by email. Just a few housekeeping matters. Phones, laptops on silent, please. If you're charging your laptop behind you, please, when we adjourn, can you just pull it in so that it's not a trip hazard? Please avoid walking in this area where there are lots of trip hazards. Toilets on the second floor. If the fire alarm sounds, it's a real one. We're not expecting a test today. So please go out the green doors just there and down and congregate in Abbey Gardens. I don't know if anyone's in the Wickham room, but the same applies there. Out the door, follow the green signs and to the Abbey Gardens. I assume everyone has seen copies of guidance notes, matters, issues and questions, hearing programme. I've produced an agenda for today. I expect you to be familiar with all of those. So my role in conducting the examination is to decide whether the local plan has been prepared in accordance with the requirements of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 as amended and associated regulations, and whether it meets the tests of soundness set out in paragraph 35 of the National Planning Policy Framework. Now, in your contributions, can you please refer to those tests of soundness as appropriate? I'm going to read those out. The first one is the plan should be positively prepared, providing a strategy which, as a minimum, seeks to meet the area's objectively assessed needs. Justified and appropriate strategy taking into account reasonable alternatives based on proportionate evidence. Effective, deliverable over the plan period and based on effective joint working on cross-boundary strategic matters. Consistent with national policy, enabling the delivery of sustainable development in accordance with the policies of the framework and other statements of national policy, planning policy, where relevant. So what I will do is on each matter, I will spend some time with the council and then I'll open it up to participants around the table. When you, or if you wish to speak, can you just turn your nameplate on its side and I'll try and bring you in at appropriate time. Please, can you make contributions to the point and brief? So if somebody just before you says something and you totally agree with them, can you just say, I've heard what so-and-so said, I totally agree with it, could I add XYZ to it? Or if you don't agree, that's very important that I hear that. If you can say, well, I've heard what so-and-so said, I disagree with it because that's the most helpful way for me to receive the information. In terms of emission sites, I won't be dealing with those in any detail at any of the hearing sessions, actually. If it is the case that we need to look for additional sites as part of the examination process, if appropriate, I'll first be turning to the council. They will propose alternative sites or additional sites, and we'll deal with those through the examination process. Okay, are there any other matters? I've done a very potted opening because now, could I please apologise to participants that we're starting later? We had a very long session this morning. and it was very important that I heard from everyone. So apologies that we've started late, but we will aim to finish in reasonable time, hopefully 5 to 5:30. Okay. Anything else that I haven't covered? Could I just remind the council, we spoke about in the previous session, we spoke about a legal judgment. Please, it was the New Forest National Park. Could I just, not now, but if you could provide me with that, and then we'll add it to the website in the usual way, please. Please remember to use your microphones. That's because acoustics aren't great, but we haven't got a very big room, so it's probably fine. But we're also being recorded, and it's very important. People just can't hear on the recordings if you don't speak into the microphone. Okay, so we're dealing with policies now. We're dealing with policies dealing with carbon reduction, carbon neutrality, and designing for low carbon infrastructure. And that's one of the first chapters in the plan, which indicates the importance for the plan and for the council. Now, so you've got an overarching strategic policy, that is policy CN1, dealing with mitigating and adapting to climate change. And right up front there, that you say the plan will help to meet the targets in the council's climate emergency declaration and reduce the district's carbon footprint by supporting the reuse and refurbishment of existing buildings where possible, and ensuring that new development is designed in a way that adapts to the challenges of climate change in a positive, comprehensive and integrated way. Then you have a number of things that development has to demonstrate with regard to mitigating against climate change, and then you do the same for adapting to climate change. All that understood. So just to set the scene, could the council please set out for me the justification, the local justification for a policy like this, a strategic policy like this that does requires that sort of information?
Thank you, Ma'am. So I'm Adrian Fox, Strategic Planning Manager. I'll be supported by my colleague to the left of me, Clara Bagter George, but I'll be dealing with predominantly, obviously, the CN1, but CN3 I'll defer to Clara, and CN8. So yes, climate emergency has been a defining issue in terms of obviously the preparation of the local plan. I think that's illustrated on page 18 of the local plan, where we basically do a diagram, basically how climate emergency basically is the kind of at the heart of the local plan in terms of basically the climate emergency obviously is there. We've got a carbon neutrality action plan, and obviously we've got a climate emergency. A similar kind of response we had in terms of design policies, that we want people to really think about this issue straight away. And that's at the heart of why we developed policy CN1, so that as part of the design process, people know that we are serious about the climate emergency and what measures they need to take. And that we think is integral to obviously how we're going to achieve obviously the climate targets we've got for the climate emergency. Obviously, in terms of its legislative background, we've got those identified in the Carbon Neutrality Action Plan. I can go through those if you want, Ma'am, but I'm sure you've read those in terms of the Climate Change Act and all those relevant bits in the NPPF, but I'm happy to explore those in further detail.
Don't worry, I'm okay on that. What about local justification?
Well, the local justification is the climate emergency, and the fact, like I say, that we want people to actually think about it as part of the design process, and that's not happening at the moment. So similar to why we've got policy D1, we want to basically clearly set out our expectations. and as part of the design process for people to actually think about how they can actually make a positive contribution towards mitigating and adapting to climate change. Hence why we've got those two requirements.
Okay, and what you do is you say that through the design process, various things have to be demonstrated, don't
That's
you?
correct.
And you ask for an energy and carbon statement, and that's at the end of the policy. Would that relate to all development? You say right at the beginning, excluding household extensions and changes of use. So would that be all development, other?
Other than those, we're excluding those for the very reason that obviously we think it's very onerous if you're doing an extension to a property to obviously go through those criteria. So we're trying to be proportionate about what we require. And obviously it is obviously targeted at obviously those larger kind of applications, 10 or more really, where basically we really want people to obviously think about it as part of the design process. And all it is basically asking people to document and to think about how they've addressed it.
Okay, where does it say 10 or more?
Well, no, sorry, that's the example is in terms of, you know,
Okay.
not small scale extension or things like that. All I'm saying is obviously, yeah, this is where the driving force for the actual
No,
process
I understand that, but the only thing it excludes
is
is
household.
household extensions, changes of use.
That's right.
And then in relation to adapting to climate change, it only excludes household extensions.
That's correct. Just check this.
Why is one household mitigating against climate changes, household extensions and changes of use and adapting to climate change?
I think they should be.
Is it just household extensions?
Sorry.
I'm happy for you to think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that requires an energy and carbon statement. And what you've done is in Appendix 1, effectively, to your statement. Do you want to introduce that? And
Yes, thank you, ma'am. So we did have a number of representations said, basically, can you please clarify what that is? We put that forward as an illustration about how we want people to address it. And obviously, hopefully it's a helpful performer. Whether or not, obviously, that needs a bit more fine tuning, polishing, etc. But that's the sense of direction that we want to go into. So we're hoping to help applicants basically go through this process. And it's asking them a series of questions basically under each heading saying, how have you done things? And that comes back to obviously justifying why you've done a certain approach.
Okay, and that also relates to CN8, doesn't it?
That's correct.
Okay, so what would be the status of that guidance? Is that in its infancy? That's still emerging.
It's in its infancy, but obviously it would be obviously part of the, I think, the validation checklist. Obviously, we've got a local validation checklist, and it's meant to help people. And obviously, I think we don't want it as part of the plan, because obviously we may well learn things as we go through this process. So we want a bit of fluidity in terms of obviously the quality and the degree that obviously the information comes back.
Okay, so how would it relate to this policy? What would be the hook for?
Well, the hook is obviously at the end of the policy, where basically where we're saying
basically, does it need to be tied? What I'm getting at, does it need to be tied? Does there need to be a commitment in this policy to produce that guidance, or does there need to be something saying we have guidance or in accordance with?
I think at the bottom of the policy, ma'am, we've got obviously all the details and checklists will be available on the council website.
Oh, sorry, where does that say?
So just at the bottom of the policy in the green text.
Yeah.
And that's where I see obviously this information sitting basically. Obviously we want to help. And obviously I think there's got to be an education kind of training kind of journey for obviously not only developers, applicants, but also obviously councillors when they obviously receive the information, and also development management officers. Because obviously they'll be assessing the applications against this policy, assuming obviously it's found sound.
Okay, so what you're saying is that what you've got at the bottom here is all you would anticipate.
Well, I think there'll be a link, Mark, from the validation checklist to the website. I think that's an easy fix that we can do. And like I say, I am assuming that obviously we would kind of elaborate on the website about what type of information and more guidance. And we can do that through obviously a technical advice note. Basically, we've got technical advice notes on the website for heritage issues. We've got technical advice notes for B&G, and they're a good way to basically signpost people to how they can do things. And they've been very successful for B&G and heritage.
Okay, and then there's this point that's been raised about heritage and including the role that heritage and retrofitting might have in terms of carbon reduction.
Yes, and obviously we've got the heritage policy itself, which we went through the other day, didn't we, in the heritage topic, at the end of the heritage topic. And obviously appreciating that obviously heritage buildings, you have to take a different approach because obviously their fabric and obviously the way they're built, etc. So, but obviously we have got a bespoke heritage policy, which obviously deals with obviously adaptations to heritage.
Okay, so are you suggesting an there?
No, I think it comes back to reading the plan as a whole, man. In terms of obviously we've got the other policy in the heritage topic.
That's HE14, isn't
That's
it?
it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I understand that. Sorry, I'm just going through. Okay, now a point has been put. Okay, this is all very good. You know, it's all good stuff and it sets out a commitment, but it hasn't got any teeth because it hasn't got any targets. And obviously you've got targets in the action plan. Should you include them?
I think it'd be very difficult to put a target in this policy itself because obviously tackling obviously the climate emergency is done on a number of fronts. We've obviously got other policies in the plan, such as the sustainable and active travel policies. So it's not solely this policy that's driving obviously our way to obviously carbon neutrality. I think it'd be very challenging to actually put a target in there, and obviously then you've got to monitor it in terms of how efficient it is. But I think it'd be very challenging in this type of policy to put a target or percentage in it. I've struggled actually how to actually kind of come up with that kind of target or how we could actually monitor that successfully.
And just to add, the relevant targets that you might choose to put in CN1 are already in CN3 and in CN8. I think CN1 is an overarching policy that describes the intent of what we're trying to do, and then you've got the targets
in the CN3
and CN11. Sorry, is it 8 or 11? Yeah,
8.
8.
Okay, and that's dealing with embodied carbon.
Yeah, that's right. So the operational carbon elements that are discussed in CN1 are dealt with in CN3 through very clear targets and embodied carbon in CN8.
Okay, could I open it up to the table now? I just want to deal with CN1. We'll get on to CN2, 3 and 4 afterwards, but just dealing with this policy, please. Mr. Gagg?
Thank you. I like you characterise as the saying, it's all very well, and we have to say we're really pleased that there's such prominence given to climate change in this, but inevitably, since this is probably at the forefront of local plan writing, and we're very pleased about that, there are gaps, and I would like to pursue your suggestion, ma'am, that there needs to be.
It wasn't a suggestion.
Sorry, your observation, your impartial observation that that does need to be just a little bit more arithmetic, and clearly maybe it doesn't sit within this plan, but there might need to be a way of tightening the carbon neutrality action plan so it contains that arithmetic, and there might need to be much firmer interrelationship. And basically this local plan is about changes or new build, and at the same time, side by side with that, we've got to do something about the existing way people live. However, my main observation, not impartial, is I feel it's great that there are all the other CNs, and it's great that there are transport policies that express warm feelings towards more sustainable transport. But I think we've got to try and be as specific about transport in some way as we've been about building structure. There are policies talking about embedded carbon in buildings, and there's going to be an energy and carbon statement to be constructed. I put in a plea that we treat transport in the same way. And the reason I say that, to pick up the word justified, is transport has twice the carbon footprint in the district as domestic and commercial, which mostly comes from the carbon efficiency of the buildings that are inhabited. So I just feel that we need to find a way of linking CN1 to the transport policies and to the site policies that make sure that the same rigor is applied to transport proposals that we have suggested here, although I'd like to see it tightening up, and some of my colleagues might suggest that. But there's a lot here about standards. There's a lot here about the nature of the infrastructure, and there's a lot here about what is required. But when we talk about transport, for some reason, all that discipline goes out the door, and we just stop at aspirations without saying what that means in terms of what we expect developers. And we saw this morning the result of that, where we had a quote from a developer that said, well, all developments have a carbon footprint, so it doesn't really matter where you put it, effectively. I'm probably distorting slightly, but it's almost like it's inevitable that we have emissions, so the detail is less important. And it's all in the detail. The devil is in the detail. And it really matters if a development is on the edge of a settlement or in the middle of a settlement, and the carbon and the energy and carbon calculations applying to something outside town rather than in the middle of town, and the carbon calculations relating to the nature of how people get to that development are crucial and will make a world of difference.
Okay.
So I ask that we take that link seriously and find a way of making that link.
Would the council like to respond to that?
I wouldn't want to repeat, obviously we've got the transport topic coming up, so I won't go into that in terms of thing, but I just do come back to I'm struggling to find how I could put a target in for some of these criteria and how you could actually actively monitor.
You're going to tell me the plan's read as a whole. Yeah, I get it. Okay. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. When you turn your nameplate up, would you mind turning it towards me so that I can see?
Apologies.
Councillor Lee, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking at page 24. I just pick up some of the points of my colleague. Looking at definitions, and as the carbon neutrality section of the local plan it develops itself as you read it as a whole, I note there's a couple of definitions which I think are lacking, and I'm just wondering whether there's merit in including that. One is upfront, embodied carbon, which we've talked about, and the other one is what I call
Sorry, where are you looking?
page 34.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you can
Yeah.
see there's a whole bunch of definitions there.
Yeah.
And then I'm looking at page 33, which talks about infrastructure delivery plan. To me, there's a bit of cognitive dissonance here in terms of we're always talking about the built environment infrastructure rather than the natural infrastructure, which goes back to the points made about ecosystems and a policy NE. And I'm just wondering again whether there's merit in just tidying this up and getting clarity of what we're talking about, because we're actually taking developers and officers and councillors and whoever into a new paradigm with this plan, which is brilliant, and I fully support it. But I just need to use clarification. Thank you.
Okay, do the council wish to comment on that? The suggestion put forward?
I think in terms of obviously, I wouldn't want to muddle what the role and purpose of the infrastructure delivery plan is, because obviously we have spent a lot of time obviously on that in terms of the infrastructure providers. And whilst I respect what Mr. Lee's saying, I think you're blurring kind of two things there. In terms of obviously embodied carbon, we do obviously deal with that in CN8, in terms of signposting people to where, obviously what that actually means, because obviously there is obviously not confusion obviously around basically what's actually required, and obviously we do signpost the whole life carbon assessment and things like that. So
You do provide a definition. I'm just looking at now.
Definition.
Para 4.51.
So I don't think there's any need to basically put it on page 34.
You might think about whether it's necessary to include that in the glossary, but that's not something that I'll interfere with, because you clearly have a definition there. Okay. Thank you. Law Holmes?
So, thank you. Good afternoon, Mum. A quick point on one of your questions in the agenda regarding the need to re-baseline developments for phase developments. Obviously, in the case of kind of hybrid applications or outline applications, we would expect conditions to be secured through reserve and delivered through reserved matters applications. So I am slightly confused about the need to re-baseline developments as they come forward, and obviously as national policy evolves, future developments, future phases will need to abide by national policy. So I'm slightly confused about whether the need to re-baseline schemes may impact deliverability and viability through additional policies that will have been developed post the implementation of the planning application.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. I've got a note and for that, and I overlooked it. Thank you for raising that point. Okay. Put that to the council, please. Is it going to impact on viability and deliverability or developability?
What we're very conscious of is that this world that we live in is changing rapidly in terms of basic technology advancements. And we're saying basically that it's reasonable and proportionate basically to ask developers to relook at this obviously later on, because 2-3 years down or 5 years down, technology may have changed, obviously, hopefully for the improvement of that. If obviously the situation is there has been no change, we are quite respectful that obviously developers can say that, well, actually, the original assumptions that we worked on are absolutely fine. So we're trying not to make it onerous, but we're also recognising that we are in a period of time where things are evolving rapidly, and we want basically applicants basically to deal with obviously the situation as it is when obviously an officer is obviously dealing with a reserved matters application, which could be some years down the line from when the original application was granted planning permission. So we're trying to do it in a proportionate way, which basically says, please just reassess this. If there is no change, you can say no change. That's absolutely fine. We're not trying to be too onerous. We're basically saying, look, we just need a statement from you to say, yes, I've taken that into account and we will accept that. And again, matters like that, we feel
is that reflected in the wording of
Well,
the policy here?
I think again, this can all be dealt with in the technical advice note or on the website. I don't think there's any necessarily need to put it in the policy. It's going to be part of the validation checklist. I think it can be dealt with elsewhere.
Okay, hear what you say. Did you want to add anything?
My point would be that I think it does need to be included in the policy to reflect any sort of situation where technology hasn't changed. So at the moment, just sort of leaving it in as sort of guidance in any sort of supporting documentation does leave it open to interpretation.
Okay, what the council's saying is a statement is always required, but it can just say, actually, there's been no change. Therefore, the baseline.
Who decides if
right.
there's been no change? Because that's the point that could be open to subjectivity. Because the technology may still be there, the cost of it may change, the impact on a master plan may change. So you may find yourself delivering fewer homes as a result of kind of changes in technology, changes in viability.
Does the council want to respond to that?
Obviously, the gentleman's obviously doing quite an extreme situation. I'm hoping that obviously that extreme situation won't actually happen. I'm hoping obviously that the cost of this technology is going to come down rather than increase. We seem rather doom and gloom that the prices are going to go up and things like that. That's not the way that the market's working. And I think basically as long as obviously the developer puts forward, what we're asking for is the developers to put forward a statement. The planning officer will obviously assess that and obviously determine in the planning balance whether or not anything has changed.
Yeah, okay. Heard what you've said. Thank you for that. So let's move on. CN2. So this.
Sorry, Mum. There's a main modification with CN1.
Okay.
On page 5 of the updated SDA 14A.
Sorry, let me just.
On page, well, it starts on page 5. It goes on page 6. I think we kind of touched on the heritage.
Sorry, that's what I was getting at.
Yeah, apologies.
Sorry, apologies. Okay.
Oversight.
Sorry, I knew I'd read it somewhere.
I knew I'd read it, so I do, but apologies for the oversight. It is there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So you've just told me.
Yeah. Sorry.
It's not justified. So
yeah.
the change isn't.
Yeah.
So Historic England have said.
Yeah.
Basically, please can you
yeah.
include this?
Yeah.
Plan read as a whole. It's in
yeah.
HE 14. I'll take that away with me, shall I? Okay.
If you can. Thank
okay.
you. Then there's amendment to criteria, the first criteria, which is basically about how and ensure, and obviously the other criteria about basically towards mitigating overheating.
Options and ensure that carbon emissions have been considered at every stage of the design process. And then in relation to criteria 14,
basically clarifying mitigating overheating.
Yeah, contribute towards mitigating
which is basically part of the design process.
Okay. Anyone got any comments on those? Okay, let's move on to the energy hierarchy that is set out in CN3. No, it's not. It's CN2. And basically that sets out the fabric first approach, maximising energy efficiency, and then renewables, and then low carbon energy.
That's correct. And there is a main modification 7, which is a new paragraph at 4.17. And again, that was put forward by Historic England about basically heritage assets and sensibly designed. And there's a minor change to the actual wording of policy CN2 to add in the first bullet to minimise energy demand for new build, which is done by employing fabric first. And that's just a point of clarification to exactly what we mean.
Okay. Sorry, and this new paragraph recognise the benefits that reuse of buildings can play in addressing climate change mitigation. Right. Does the plan otherwise support retention, repair and reuse of existing buildings?
Well, certainly in terms of obviously the embodied carbon one starts from that premises in terms of obviously it's better to obviously reuse a building rather than knock it down. So that premise obviously is in the local plan. So that's kind of a driving force for that embodied carbon policy.
Okay. And the purpose of this policy, bearing in mind we've just been speaking about CN1. They're read together, I know.
It's very much
just
so.
not a statement of.
Yeah, it's just very much so in terms of basically making sure that basically people think about that hierarchy as part of the design process.
Okay. Does anybody have any comments on this, please?
Yes, please. I wonder if I could just clarify, sorry if I missed it, but in terms of the energy hierarchy, thinking about the fabric first and embodied energy and embodied carbon, is that clear enough in terms of the approach for the design before you build in that consideration in policy CN2?
Sorry, Councillor Lee.
I'm just not
Yes.
reading the box on page 39.
Yes.
And I'm asking myself the question about the fabric first approach,
Yes.
which obviously is axiomatically important.
Please.
We're discussing the main modification 7, which adds a lot of clarity.
Okay.
So there's the statement that was just read out, which would clarify that.
So that clarifies that. That's the new policy after 4.17.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. There's a paragraph that's about the plan recognising the benefits of reuse in buildings and, and it supports the retention and repair of existing buildings. So I understand that you might have thought that it wasn't clear enough, but it is now there. So
yeah. Okay. Sorry. I apologise. I see that now. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you mind putting your nameplate down? Sorry, can you make sure that nameplates are turned towards me so that I can read them? Okay, let's, anybody have any further comments on that? Let's move on to CN3. And CN3 sets energy standards to reduce carbon emissions. And the nub of the concern here is that they deviate from nationally set standards, isn't it? So, first of all, can I ask, I don't mind who from the council, to introduce this policy, please, and exactly what its requirements are. I've set out a sort of high level what they are, but could you just explain to us?
So the policy introduces a different type of assessment.
Yes.
To understand and evaluate the energy consumption of buildings. So the first one of these is a requirement around space heating demand, that it must be lower than 15 kilowatt hours per square metre. The second is the total energy consumption of the dwelling, that it must be less than 35 kilowatt hours per square metre per year. And the third is that the total energy consumption of the buildings and the total energy generated by the renewables must be balanced. So you need to generate the same amount over the course of a year that you use as renewables. Now so
it is over the course of a year.
It is. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's relating to new residential development.
And that's all residential development, excluding conversion and change of use.
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. For non-residential development, there's a different approach taken where we're looking for applicants to meet BREEAM Excellent. But in addition to this, we're asking that applicants maximise on-site renewables. So it's not about an energy balance anymore, but it's just about maximising on the roof, and then it need to report the total installed capacity, the area of photovoltaic panels and the roof plan to show that they've maximised renewables. So the policy, the kind of at the pre-app, you don't need to prove that you're meeting the policy at pre-app. But at outline stage, we'd expect that typical buildings are modelled and predictive energy modelling to show that they're meeting the policy, and
Yeah.
with full planning and reserve matters, a representative sample of the buildings.
Okay, thank you for that. So you provide a justification for this because we're all in agreement. It deviates from the nationally prescribed standards. So can you tell me what specifically in Winchester justifies an approach that deviates from those nationally prescribed standards?
Yeah. So it's clear that I guess the evidence of need that's local is that the city council really.
Sorry. Could you speak up a little bit?
Apologies. So the city council would like to develop this plan to be consistent with national and local net zero policies, and as Adrian's spoken about just now, that Winchester declared a climate emergency, wants to be a carbon neutral district by 2030, and therefore the council has evaluated the best way that they can do that when it relates to new buildings in this local plan, and how they can reduce energy bills for residents. So, we know that the Future Home Standard is coming. But it's not clear yet what the future home standard will be. There's been various consultations, but there's uncertainty around the ambition, and also on the impact of the residents' energy bills. So it was decided that the council couldn't reliably base its policy on the Future Home Standard. The energy modelling methodology used for the Future Home Standard is not available yet either. So in the absence of the Future Home Standard, the council is proposing a policy that's going to be consistent with the Future Home Standard in terms of focusing on reducing energy, increasing energy efficiency, implementing low carbon heat and renewable energy generation. But based on the options tested in the latest consultation, it was felt that the technical specifications in the Future Home Standard won't go far enough to meet the ambitions that Winchester have around carbon neutrality. So that's why a different approach has been taken, and this different approach is aligned with a lot of others nationally. So it's not just an approach that Winchester are taking and nobody else is taking. It's an approach that is in line with the recommendations of the Climate Change Committee, which has the space heating demand of 15 to 20. And we believe that the Future Home Standard sets this floor, national floor that can be achieved in the least viable areas of the UK, but we're not in one of those areas here in Winchester. And we've shown, through a lot of work that's been done in the industry, that this is the best and most appropriate way to reduce carbon emissions, reduce energy and carbon emissions in a way that is proportionate, but also is in line with what other local councils are doing. It's in line with industry best practice, which some other local authorities are doing. Yeah. It's in line with best practice in terms of where the market's going in terms of aligning with net zero carbon.
So based on the options that were tested for the latest Future Home Standard consultation, what you're saying is what's specific to Winchester is that you don't think that's going to meet their ambition.
No. Yeah, that's right.
I understand that.
And we can go through in detail, if you'd like, about the kind of justification about why the Future Home Standard metrics are not thought to be justified.
Let's not move on. Okay, so I've understood that. I've understood what you're saying there. Let's just move on to the nub of it.
Mm-hmm.
That does it accord with national policy? Now, what you say to me is that you can set local standards that exceed baseline national building regulations, and indeed there's no restriction in the way that they're expressed.
Yes.
So we've got para 159 of the NPPF that clearly says any local requirements for the sustainability of buildings should reflect government policy for national technical standards. And then we've got the WMS, haven't we? That doesn't preclude exceeding standards, but what it says is, in this context, the government does not expect plan makers to set local energy efficiency standards for buildings that go beyond current or planned building regulations. And it sort of says, well, if you are going to do it, you need to comply with, one, it needs to be well-reasoned, robustly costed, needs to have a well-reasoned, robustly costed rationale.
Yep.
It needs the development needs to remain viable, and the impact on housing supply and affordability needs to be considered. And then any additional requirement is expressed as a percentage uplift of the target emission rates calculated using the specified version of the standard assessment procedure.
Yep.
You're not doing any of that.
We're doing the first two.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. You're not doing any. Sorry, I meant the last. The last bullet point. Okay, so that's where we're sitting. Tell me why, and you say that actually what you're doing does accord with national policy. Now you need to justify that to me, please.
Yeah. Are you going to take this one, or shall I?
Well, important to put the thing in its proper legal context.
Yep.
That this is guidance. It's not a statutory requirement.
What, the NPPF?
The well, both actually.
Both,
I mean,
yeah.
in truth, but in particular, the strictures of the written ministerial statement. The truth is, we violate only the mechanism by which the change has to be expressed. Using the target emissions rate, we don't do that. Now that is, I mean, one can't escape the fact that those words are written, but we say, and Clara in a moment for the details of this, but we have a coherent rationale, which is a sufficient basis for you to conclude that, notwithstanding what that piece of guidance says, that this is a sound policy for achieving a fundamental objective of planning policy and many other central government policies now. We draw attention to another inspector's decision tendering where a similar approach to ours was found sound for exactly the reasons which we promote now.
Well, that to use it, I mean, it's very difficult to draw comparisons, obviously. The specifics of that policy, did they mirror this?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
I can look that
that's
up.
the point.
Yeah, they are the same.
Okay, I can look that up. Okay. While you're there, you might give an opinion, because what I on whether you can basically the Estelle Dehone legal opinion. Can you give a view on that, please?
Well, she's got it right.
That's open letter.
She's
No, I don't want to. You want to on the legal opinion? Is that something that you accord with? I presume from what you've said in your position that it is.
Yes. I mean, what Estelle says. Sorry, Estelle Dehone, KC. It is that we have the authority in law to set standards which go beyond, and it's a matter really of the interplay between our legal entitlement to do this and the fact that there is government guidance which says on this particular metric you've got to use metric A rather than metric B. And as I say, provided that we offer you a coherent rationale, which we say, frankly, in spades that we do, then you are entitled, as part of your discretion in considering whether something is sound, to say, well, this is only guidance and they've got good reasons for not following that guidance. And that is as far in law as guidance can ever take you. To a situation where it should be followed unless there's good reason not to. Here we say clearly there is good reasons, not good reason not to follow that one particular aspect.
Okay, let me, thank you for that. Let me just open it up to the floor. Now, I want to deal with viability as a sort of separate topic. So no need, unless you just want to refer to viability when you're talking about justification for this. And
I mean, one should add, Ma'am, just
Yeah.
on viability, that we've specifically viability tested these policies.
I know that.
So basically our whole plan viability assessments assessed the viability of this policy. Plus, in conjunction with that, we've had Curry Brown basically working with Clara's team, basically looking at the viability as well. And those two consultancy firms, which are well respected, have bounced ideas off and tested and challenged each other. So we feel very confident on the viability side of things that we've done a very thorough job in terms of basically justifying this policy.
Well, okay, then I'll open it up to the floor because there are other people around the room who have a different opinion. So yes, by all means do. We'll wrap up with viability because I understand what you've said, and obviously people around the table think that those figures are depressed somewhat. So let's start off, please. Bargate Homes, Mr. Milner. Sorry, Mr. Miller. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Good afternoon, Mark. I'm Martin Miller. I'm from Tor & Co. I'm representing Bargate Homes. They are a local house builder, one of the local house builders who the government is trying to support with its latest set of planning reforms, which were announced last week. Bargate disagree with the council's position.
Yeah.
Although sustainability is at the heart of everything that Bargate does, developing net zero homes is an expensive business. And sitting here today, national policy is quite clear, paragraph 161, that we're on a transition to net zero. And it's that transition by 2050. So it's not instantaneous, I think is the point that I want to make on that. And sitting here today, we do not have to build net zero dwellings. The written ministerial statement, which dates from 2023.
Yeah.
That written ministerial statement, and I would like you to draw your attention to parts of it which we haven't just discussed.
Okay.
But it was the subject of a judicial review, which was adjudicated last year by Mrs. Justice Leven. She dismissed the legal challenge to it. And in her judgment, which you may have seen, she has underlined various pertinent elements of that. One of which is the following statement. It says, any planning policies that propose local energy efficiency standards for buildings that go beyond current or planned building regulations should be rejected at examination if they do not have a well-reasoned and robustly costed rationale that ensures, and then there's the clauses about viability. So there is a presumption against this type of policy unless the council justifies it. So actually, I think it is for the council to justify its position, albeit in light of the opposition that you'll probably get from our side of the table today. So that was the first point I wanted to mention. It's also clear the two limbs of the written ministerial statement obviously refer to the TER, which the council accepts that it doesn't deliver, and it's put forward an alternative. Unfortunately for the council, I don't think the written ministerial statement says or an alternative. If that was in the written ministerial statement, I think the council would be entirely justified in bringing forward its policy, but it's not there. And the written ministerial statement is material consideration and is designed to ensure that we don't have a proliferation of energy efficiency standards across the UK, which if this is allowed to go forward, we would start to have. So actually, I understand why the City Council wishes to come forward, but we're going to end up with a position which is completely opposite to what the WMS is seeking to deliver. Can I just move quickly on to viability? So the viability report, and indeed the derivation of this policy, and I'll happily be corrected by the council. But Elementa, who produced the original study, can I draw your attention to the timings of that work? That work was started in July 2022 and was updated in August 2023, possibly 2024. July 2022, and there is a statement at paragraph 7.2 of that report, which, for the avoidance of doubt, I will quote briefly. It was a quote by Curry and Brown, who inputted into the viability report, but effectively it says that everything is based on Q2 2022 residential costs. That's 3 months before the Liz Truss budget. That's exactly 3 years ago to where we sit here today. And I submit to you that if I was to put together a viability appraisal for a planning application that I would be handling, I don't think I'd get very far with a viability appraisal based on those costs. So I would suggest to you that the costs that have been put forward in the original evidence base are out of date. If it's been updated since, please point me in the direction of it, but that's the position that I see it on viability.
Okay. Oh,
I've got one other
yeah,
point, if I may.
Yeah.
The policy and the dates of the Elementa report are critical to this. So the policy in the local plan has been suggested by Elementa, and it seems to have it has evolved from the original report dating from 2022. The written ministerial statement was published a year later, and at no point between 2022 and 2024, when the plan was submitted, have the council changed from the EUI to the TER version, which the written ministerial statement calls for. So actually the council's had 2 years to adapt its evidence base so that it accorded with the written ministerial statement, and it hasn't. So we're sitting here today. There may be very good reasons why the EUI is used. I'm not an expert in that field, so I will let others.
We've heard, we can hear them from the council. Yeah.
So I just point out that actually we're in a situation where we're almost justifying the council's position predating the written ministerial statement, not dealing with something which could actually accord with the WMS. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Just quickly to the council on that point. Would you have written another policy? Were you
No.
To take the WMS into account?
No, I mean, I mean, the way it was put is if we kind of blissfully ignorant of the written ministerial statement and just put to the side. Obviously, we've given it very careful consideration, and we believe we've got compelling reasons for saying that the TER measure is, for the purposes which we need it, inappropriate and ineffective as a measure. I mean, we set it out in detail in our hearing statement.
Yeah.
Clara will probably want to jump in and just amplify and explain what I've said, but it needs to be absolutely clear that we have considered that. Obviously, of course we have, but we've taken a reasoned view for what we say are compelling reasons that the TER is the wrong measure.
Yeah, I mean, basically what you're doing in this policy, you're taking the space heating demand and energy use intensity, the EUI, as opposed to the building regulation metrics, aren't you? Which is the target emission rate and the dwelling fabric energy efficiency and rate. And you give the reasons why. That's the another bit, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll come back to you on that because please, Mr. Gagg.
Thank you. If it helps with justification, might not, but I think we do need to register that emissions per head of population in Winchester are 20% approximately above national average. So Winchester is behind the rest of behind the average in the country on emissions production, and we really need to do something exceptional to counteract that. They're government figures for 2022.
you for that. Mr. Brent?
A couple of points coming from what the councillor have just said. I think turning to the written ministerial statement first, in terms of, I think dismissing it as guidance. I think we know in terms of understanding that a written ministerial statement should be read as if it was national policy in terms of the NPPF. I think that's clear. I think that was in the judgment that was made with regard to West Berkshire in terms of the affordable housing written ministerial statement, which in terms of the less than 10 units that was made, I think, 2013. So I think that was established back then in terms of reading written ministerial statement as national policy, which means that then we turn to paragraph, obviously the tests of soundness, which do state that consistent with national policy, films in accordance with the policies in this framework and other statements of national planning policy. So therefore, we can't be in any doubt or disagreement that this is not consistent with the written ministerial statement and therefore not consistent with national planning policy. And I think that's the point that we need to retain here. I think in terms of then looking at it, in terms of then going to the legal judgments and the legal position in terms of the Planning and Energy Act 2008, recognise that that's in place and that does allow local authorities to go beyond, but it is within the context of national standards, and that was the intention of the PEA 2008, and that's within the judgment in terms of Justice Leven, recognising that in terms of what the Secretary of State said at the time, in terms of ensuring that it goes beyond building regulations, but it is within that national framework. And indeed, the PEA itself states that it's in terms of is clear that relates to standards. It says set out or referred to in regulations made by the appropriate national authority under or by virtue of any other enactment, and that's set out or endorsed by national policies or guidance issued by the appropriate national authority. Then says that the appropriate national authority is the Secretary of State. So essentially, what's that doing is again reaffirming what the written ministerial says in terms of saying statement says in terms of actually you can go beyond, but it is within this clear framework of saying actually it has to relate back to national standards, which again relates back to 159 of that. So in terms of that, the written ministerial statement is consistent with both the legislation, which says you should be looking at it in terms of those national standards. So that's legislation rather than just policy in terms of material consideration. So I think those elements have to be looked at. It can't be looked at in isolation in terms of what the legislation said and what the intention of that legislation was in terms of that. This goes back in terms of, if you look at it in terms of coastal sustainable homes, which was part of that intention, which was very clearly set out in terms of used to be coastal sustainable homes 3. For you'll know, Ma'am, from your times. I remember them back in when they were there and then when they left again. And perhaps that is where some of the problem lies in terms of that gap in terms of policy and intention that's led to this grey area and confusion that I think the written ministerial statement has looked to address within that in terms of how they can go about this. So I think that points to that. I think in terms of tendering was mentioned in terms of that was in relation to the garden community and that it was a different policy in terms of it was the standards were different in terms of, I think it was 30 for space heating and 40 in terms of so in terms of the intention of the policy, Miss George was Bagnall George was rolling her eyes then, but it is different in terms of that. But it's also in terms of I don't think there was that particular debate in terms of it. I'd have to look in terms of that, but the promoter of that garden village wasn't contesting it. So in terms of that, so I think they'd accepted that was an appropriate standard for that site and for that garden community, rather than actually looking at the whole plan. And I would then refer you back to the post-hearing note from the inspectors examining the Isle of Wight, where there was a robust debate about this, much as we're having here, and they concluded that a policy that was the same as this one was not consistent with national policy, and if it were to move forward, then it would have to be amended to reflect national policy. So, again, I see you tendering, and I'll raise you Isle of Wight in terms of that. Sorry, in terms of being facetious in terms of that, Ma'am. But it's that intention. You need to look at the facts in this. You need to look at the facts in terms of the legislation, in terms of the written ministerial statement. what you are doing here is creating a multiplicity of standards, and that multiplicity is more than one. You are creating another standard within this that has to be done. I think Mr. Miller has raised in terms of the concerns. There are differences in terms of what it will cost. We raised that in terms of the new the Future Homes Hub work, which shows that it's significantly higher than what the council is suggesting. So there are concerns. A lot of it we don't know yet. These are new standards coming in. There's uncertainty. And I think this is why the government really wants to be clear in terms of saying, actually, we just want one standard as we move forward to the Future Home Standard. The Future Home Standard delivers zero carbon ready homes. So you know, we are moving towards a much improved standard. We then have the homes energy model. We'll have another standard here. We'll have the homes energy model. We'll have this. Yeah, it starts to get very confusing if you have planning policies that beyond that. And I think for a developer, that's very uncertain in terms of actually which ones are, oh, I've got to do this in Winchester, but I'll have to do something else over here, and how that's going to impact on deliverability. And I think that delivery aspect is something the council haven't looked at in terms of they've talked about viability, and the viability is in the viability. But in terms of actually how's this going to impact in terms of how many homes are going to come forward, the rate at which they will come forward over the course of the plan period. I don't think that work's actually been done in terms of looking at it in that way. Just in terms of the assessment, how it's going to be assessed, do they have the skills? Is the skills there to deliver this policy? Do they have the skills in development management to understand the outcomes of some of the assessments that are there? I think there's lots of uncertainty there, ma'am. I think that is why, as my mouth gets drier from talking so much, I'm sorry,
We'll get you some water.
Thank you, ma'am. I think it is, though, but those are my key points. I think there are a number of concerns. It's not consistent. There are concerns about deliverability. You know, we're in a changing world. You know, we believe we should be relying on the Future Home Standard and just moving forward on that basis, but recognise why the council wants to go further in terms of a net zero target and in terms of the Planning and Energy Act, which allows them to go beyond. But it's beyond, but at least within the framework that we're presented with at the moment. Thank you, Mel.
No, thank you very much. Bloor Holmes.
Yes, thank you, Mum. So I'm not going to repeat what Mr. Miller and Mr. Red have said with regard to the lack of consistency with national planning policy. I think they've said it very, very clearly and referenced the right sort of policies. I'm going to pick up on 2 points. One is regarding effectiveness of the net zero carbon policy and the need to generate as much energy from on-site sources as is consumed.
Okay, so you're on to question 3. What is the robust evidence to justify the requirement for 100% on-site renewable energy for energy consumption? Okay, yes. You asked. Yeah.
And then there was another point I had on the viability and cost space as well.
That's fine.
Okay. Yep. So the point has not been addressed within the policy about grid capacity and infrastructure constraints. So obviously when a development is planned, there needs to be a certain amount of capacity available in the local grid, not just to provide that development with power, but also to absorb power from that development. Those two numbers are different. And if there is not the capacity in the local grid to absorb the power that's generated by development at the time in which different phases come online, that power is effectively wasted. So what you then have a requirement is for additional PV panels, additional renewables infrastructure to be provided on site, which has an embodied carbon footprint, but the power generated by that is then curtailed or wasted. So unless there is a requirement within this policy to state that the export capacity has to be assessed in conjunction with the distribution network operator for the local grid, then there may be an issue by which the development cannot achieve the net zero carbon objective by generating and using the same amount of energy that's generated on site being exported to the grid, and therefore the policy will not be effective in its implementation.
Okay.
The second point I was going to add was about the concerns that I have that over the costs that are quoted in the evidence base. Again, Mr. Miller has made a point about the age of these costs. I would also add that there's no granularity given on the costs on various measures taken to achieve the standards that are set out in that policy. Yes, I've no doubt that they were produced by experts within their field, both cost consultancy and sustainability. But without the granularity of those individual costs of the additional wall insulation, of the additional building systems technologies, without the cost of the renewables, it's very difficult for a reader of that policy to determine whether or not those costs are robust. So as such, I feel there is concern over the robustness of the policy and the evidence base in that regard.
Thank you very much. Council, please, could you respond to what's been said? I particularly want to know about the viability. I don't want to get too much into viability because we're going to have a session on this. I think it's tomorrow, isn't it?
Yes.
But can you just, while we've got contributors around the table, can you just speak one about, I mean, the differences in costs if you take from HBF Ready for Zero, detached is 17 and semi-detached 22. Sorry, the other way around, isn't it? 17 to 22 per home, and you've got 11, just over 11 for a detached home and 9.4 for a semi-detached home. Those are there's quite a difference there, and you've heard what has been said across the table about the date of those costs.
Yeah, of course. So there's 3 points I think it's important to raise here relating to viability.
Yeah.
I'd quite like to come back to some of the other points afterwards if we can.
Yes, absolutely.
But taking viability first. So yes, the assessment was done with data that was available at the time of the assessment, 2022, 2023. These type of assessments is the kind of bread and butter of what I do. And so I've been working with lots of various local authorities right now on these kind of policies, and the percentage uplifts are coming out very similar with this year's data. So yes, I know that's not like a written report I can give you, but if you need something more about that, then I'm sure we can prepare something. Secondly, the piece on that was just asked about, that we didn't share enough detail about the assessment. In the last page of the evidence-based report, there's a graph and it outlines how much what the uplift is for every item. So I'm not quite sure what additional detail is required. So thirdly, there's this point.
Sorry, can you refer me to that, please?
Yeah, it's the last page of the evidence base. Which I can, so it's the last page of the updated evidence base, yeah. So the August 2023, and it has a graph, and the graph states with details, that it's £11 more per square metre for floor, that it's £26 more per square metre for the external walls, and there's corresponding specifications that show the comparator, which is building regulations, and the policy requirements. Page 50.
Page 50, thank you.
Yeah. So that hopefully covers that point. And then lastly, so the Future Homes Hub, I think it's Ready for Net Zero report, provides costings that relate to various contender specifications, and this was done in the preparation of work for the Future Home Standard. And so various representations have been made that say, well, contender specification 4 is similar to the outcomes of this policy, and that's around £20,000, and you're saying it should be around £10,000, and what's going on here? So we've looked into this in much more detail, and Curry and Brown have provided a short 2-page report which explicitly shows why we think the costs aren't relevant to this work in Winchester. So we've looked at it in detail. I think it's important to highlight that in the executive summary of this Ready for Zero report, the stakeholders disagreed with the published costs. So it says stakeholders strongly agreed with the 2022 costs of the contender specifications, and it's important to know that estimating the cost of building them at scale and from 2026 was not attempted. So first of all, the report says there's not agreement within the stakeholders of the costs. So secondly, as I said, there's differences between this contender specification 4 and the way we believe that this CN3 policy requirement should be costed. And we've got them itemised. So we don't consider that this report is comparable or to hold as much weight as the Winchester specific cost analysis. And it's something that I can, it's very detailed. It goes on to talking about because the Future Homes, the Future Homes Hub report says the specification, this is what's costed, and it includes wastewater heat recovery, which our standard doesn't. It assumes more solar PV and a much higher cost of solar PV than we believe is appropriate. It doesn't. So we need lower capacity heating system and less radiators because we have less space heating demand. So we have reduced the quantities of that in our costing, and that's not been done in this model. There's the way that the contractor preliminaries are costed, we don't agree with. So they've just had a straight 9% uplift, but actually preliminaries are the same cost no matter whether you have high specifications or not. And they include various things that we don't believe need to be included with PV and diverters. And they've got very high cost for MVHR. So we've got it detailed, but in summary, if you take all of those and it itemises each one, it changes the cost to be in a very similar order of magnitude to what we've got in our report. So I've prepared this 2-page report and I've got enough copies for everybody if you'd like to see a copy of it.
Hold on to that for the moment. We're going to have a discussion on viability tomorrow.
Yeah.
Is that something that?
Yeah, I won't be here tomorrow, but you can still use the Adrian will be here.
And we'll deal with that.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there were other points that were raised.
There were quite a few, yeah. So I wanted to, there's this kind of how you legally interpret the WMS is something that you may want to not go into so much detail on. We've got Estelle's report that we've said, we agree with, and that goes in a lot of detail and it's a lot of pages. So we can summarise it, but I don't feel the need to do it, but I do feel the need to respond to some of the points that were raised.
Yes,
is that okay?
Please, yes, absolutely.
So Mr. Miller spoke about Justice Levin's response to a challenge on the WMS. But actually, the reason why the legal challenge was unsuccessful was because because she found that the WMS didn't prohibit local authorities from implementing net zero policies. So the whole point was that that they were taken to court because they said this stops local authorities implementing policies that reduce carbon, which is problematic. And Justice Levin said it doesn't. So that's really important to note. Doesn't prevent, and it doesn't prevent local plan policies from bringing forward any policies with energy-based metrics. So I think that was important to mention. Also, this from a point that was made, the Secretary of State has clarified the WMS does not restrain local planning authorities from applying development plan policies or exercising Section 1 powers. So we've had a lot of, this is complex and it's for you to make a decision on where you believe it stands. But we have a lot of kind of evidence that I believe that shows that the WMS, it is a recommendation by the government for sure, but it doesn't prohibit local authorities to implement energy efficient policies that aren't aligned with TER metric, as long as they have justifications, which we didn't go through before, and I can go through. So also Isle of Wight was raised. So yes, the planning inspector for Isle of Wight said that it was not sound, but the reasons for that were viability, and we know that you can only put forward more stringent energy efficiency policies if it's viable, right? And in Isle of Wight, it wasn't viable. So that's the main reason. And we've got some more information on that. I just need to get the right bit of paper out.
So don't worry too much because Isle of Wight is still at examination.
Sorry?
Isle of Wight is still at
Yeah.
examination. So,
But the other point, sorry, I won't go through the details of the viability of that, but the other piece was flexibility.
Yeah.
So the Isle of Wight policy didn't have any flexibility in it, whereas ours does. And that's a really important difference. So
tell me where the flexibility is in this policy.
the policy says where clear and compelling reasons have been shown to prevent policy compliance. Wait, I'm reading the wrong thing, but can we get it here?
Yeah, these should be in line with requirements set out below unless there are exceptionally clear and compelling reasons.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So there is flexibility there that can, applicants can say to the council because of this reason, for instance, like as was mentioned, if there is I'll weave this into the grid constraints point. So, there are some grid constraints here in Winchester, but that will be upgraded by 2030. So we believe that because the greenfield, most homes to be developed before 2030 are in brownfield sites, so most homes they're going to be smaller developments, and the issues with grid constraints are more problematic with larger developments. So we don't think that there is going to be a problem. But if there were to be a problem, we believe that this clause in the policy gives the flexibility to say, and that there are grid constraints, right? And the intent is that through some technical advice notes, the council will be clear on what that is. For example, we will write what happens if there is an export constraint. So if the district network operator identifies an export constraint, then we'll be clear what to do in that situation.
Okay, could I just ask you, exceptionally, and I don't mind who from the council, exceptionally clear and compelling reasons, what might they be? I mean, you said the capacity of the national grid. I've got that, but what sort of things would that be?
So, for example, we believe that our policy is relevant for the majority of cases that are coming forward in Winchester, but in some cases it would be challenging to meet the policy. So, for example, if there was a heritage setting that meant that you could only have a one-storey development, so it'd be quite a kind of, imagine rather than a house being 3 stories or 4 stories, it's a lot of single-story space, right? That would affect the space heating demand because there's quite a lot of fabric area, a lot of wall and roof area comparatively. So that would make it harder to achieve the 15 kilowatt hours requirement. So, but that could be easily justified. And you can say, okay, there's a heritage constraint here, we have to do this, but that means our space heating demand is something else, and then that'd be accepted.
Can I make a couple of observations,
please.
Ma'am, if I may? Just if I can just backtrack once more on this point about the Britain ministerial statement, be clear exactly what the legal framework is.
Yeah.
The Act, the primary legislation, the 2004 Act, requires, I'm going to use the word merely and use it advisedly, merely requires that the local planning authority must have regard to national policies and advice contained in guidance issued by the Secretary of State. So there's no legislative requirement to follow every dot and comma of national guidance. One must simply have regard to that. And clearly we've done that because we've provided extensive justification as to why we're not following on this one particular aspect. Secondly, in terms of the test of soundness, paragraph 35D of the NPPF we're using talks about, it says consistent with national policy, fine, enabling the delivery of sustainable development in accordance with the policies in this framework and other statements of national planning policy. So the emphasis is on the fact that the NPPF and other government documents are there to provide sustainable development. And we say that obviously sustainability is at the absolute core of these policies we promote in this area. It is worth looking at the tendering decision, we set out the relevant paragraph in our statement because that provides exactly the right legal framework. It's a material consideration, of course, but like all other material considerations, it's capable of being displaced in appropriate circumstances. And what I would just also observe is that round the table, although there's been lots of pointing at the words saying you've got to use TER, there's not been a justification as to why that is the only way of achieving the policy objective. And there's been no contradiction of what we've said, extensively set out in our material, which everyone's had the chance to consider, as to why our use of the EUI measure is the correct thing. And that is worth noting. And then just one final point, which we just were touching on, is obviously the reference to exceptionally clear and compelling reasons. There's two things really to observe, well, three things to observe about that. The first is that by their nature, it's difficult to say what those might be. That's the nature of a sort of a get out clause. Secondly, a couple of the points which have loomed large in the discussion around the table, grid connection and capacity and viability, they would both be perfectly capable of being accommodated within that policy framework. And finally, we do seek exceptionally clear and compelling reasons because this is an incredibly important policy. These carbon neutrality policies are at the heart of what the plan is seeking to do, as you've already observed. And therefore, it's not surprising that if people are going to get out of the requirements, that the evidence they need to provide should be exceptionally clear and compelling. So those are my observations.
Thank you. Yes.
One more point.
Yes.
On what was raised before, which was about skills. Now I wanted to raise.
Yes, and whether the nub of it is, should this be phased because you need the opportunity to get skills in place.
That's right. That's right. So I've been doing some work for Essex County Council, which isn't in Winchester, but it's in Southern England, and as part and they have a similar policy position. So yes, tendering was the same metrics but slightly different targets. Essex, a model policy, is the same metrics and the same targets. But we did some work where we did a survey, did some interviews with developers and house builders in Essex. That's published, available on the Essex website, and we can provide that if required, which showed that developers and house builders were largely familiar and comfortable with the skills needed to require for net zero carbon homes. So that is from the kind of building side, kind of there. From the council side, where councils have implemented these policies, there does need to be support on how to assess the applications. But this is something that I'm familiar with doing, and there's lots of documentation that's been created and developed to both support applicants design and build to these levels, and also policy officers to be able to understand and review the applications. I don't need to do it now, but I would quite like to go through our justification for why we're changing metric.
Yeah, I will come on to that.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, Mr. Miller.
Thank you. I'm just going to come back on a couple of points, if I may. The first one was I did, in my comments, talk about the WMS and what the WMS
I've read that
was allowed to do, and I pointed out that it does say that you're allowed to depart if you follow the TER. It doesn't have any other caveats that say or an alternative. So I did raise that. I just want to comment briefly on the tendering example, which you've been asked to consider. That, as I understand it, is a garden community of 7,500 houses with 30% affordable housing. It's effectively a large site allocation. It's a million miles away from a plan that covers a myriad of planning of site allocations. So I think they are chalk and cheese. And just because an inspector has said everything is okay on that one, that had developer support. Here, you haven't got developer support for the policy. So they are different. And the final point was something on renewable energy. I mentioned earlier that the policies in the local plan have come from the Elementa report. The Elementa report, when it talked about renewable energy policy, talked about maximising renewable energy. There isn't any reference that I could see to 100%. So I don't think there's actually any support for the 100% in that policy. Unless I've missed it, I'll happily be put right. But the objective was to maximise it. I think the 100% may have come from the council.
Good. Thank you. Mr. Barrett?
Just a couple of points, Mark. Just in terms of, I don't think we're in disagreement that the council can't go beyond in terms of
No,
net zero.
I
So I don't think that was a
clear
point
on
that really
Yeah.
needed to
Yeah.
just to stress. Or in fact that it's not material consideration. I think it is, but I think it's still coming back to very strongly in terms of what the tests of soundness are, which you know, Marm, so I don't need to go there. I think in terms of the costings and in terms of the Future Homes Hub and the disagreement, I think what we've got to understand is the Future Homes Hub, in terms of their work, is a broad church in terms of who's there. It includes development industry in terms of house builders, as well as people such as Letty and those. And there will be disagreement, but I think it's coming to that point where actually this is coming from a broad church in terms of what they've set out, rather than just purely from the council's perspective, rather than actually those. And I think there are different ways of costing these requirements, some which will be higher. And I think it is ensuring that it's not always going to be the lowest number figure, and actually those costs could be higher. And I think it's recognising in the assessments of viability that the cost could be significantly higher than what the council is suggesting, rather than saying, oh, it's not going to be this, it's not going to make it this. So I think that needs to be recognised, and potentially that needs to be tested within the viability assessment, whether that broader, that higher cost could be accommodated within this local plan. So I think those are just my points at the moment. I don't necessarily think there are those clear and compelling reasons to depart from those very specific points which Mr. Miller has just made, in terms of, yes, you can go beyond, but it is very clear that these are the reasons, this is the basis on which you can do that. And that comes back to the Planning and Energy Act, which is primary legislation.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Jessica?
Thank you. Yeah, just coming back on a couple of points, clarifications. Firstly, my point on costs, take the points that were made regarding the granularity that's provided in the appendix. It's worth noting that these are cost uplifts, not absolute costs. So it's still difficult to ascertain whether the costs that have been specified are consistent with what the rest of the industry sees, things we've only got a cost uplift. The other point is regards the clear and compelling reasons that are quoted within the text of the policy. I would state that in order to be unambiguous and clear, then potential reasons should be listed within the body of the policy. Otherwise, what constitutes a clear and compelling reason could be open to interpretation between applicants and policymakers. So I think we'd say that there would need to be a list of examples under what constitutes clear and compelling reasons, including things like grid capacity, heritage, so on and so forth, so that there would be reasons given for why.
Examples of situations.
Examples of acceptable situations.
Yeah, I understand. Okay. Council, please.
So
Yeah, I don't need any more help. Sorry, I don't need any more help on the legal position or the WMSPs. I've got that.
thanks.
Please.
So I would like to respond to Mr. Miller's point, and he was saying that the Elementa evidence base didn't recommend 100% renewable energy balance. It does. It's a policy recommendation. The report is on page 43. So
Okay.
it's there.
And is that reflected in policy?
Yeah, it's the same
Yeah.
policy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
As in the policy recommendation has been taken forward into the policy.
Okay.
So I think the point around the costs and the Future Homes Hub report, I mean, our costs, I mean, Adam from Cohen Brown, who led on the work, he's not here today, but, Cohen Brown, they've carried out cost analysis. It's based on 20 years of work. looking at this kind of situation. They have worked for the Climate Change Committee. They are the cost consultants. I mean, he's leading the costings of the Future Home Standard. They work for MHCLG Part L 2021. All of this. So it's not just the council's view, right? They are an independent source that work with lots of developers on their projects and also work for local authorities and national government. And we haven't, you know, of course the costs can be high. You can make net zero expensive if you want to, right? You can over specify, you can do it in ways that it looks like it's expensive. And also, but you know, the costs that we've shown are reasonable. They're not like the lowest they could be. In fact, we could have made them lower. You know, through good design, you can actually bring down those costs, and all of that hasn't been. We've like for like costed a building regulations building, and then a regulation, a building with a specification that meets the policy without making the building design better. So yeah, I think just it's important to note that Curry and Brown. It's not just the council.
Okay, I get that.
I think those were the points raised I wanted to respond to.
Just before I will come, I do want a justification for why you're using space heating demand and energy use intensity. I just want to quickly move on to, you're asking for information here. I want to just know what you're going to do with it. You're asking for information in the policy. What will you do with it effectively? Okay. And how will it be monitored? Now, I don't want to get too much into the details of monitoring, but I just want to know what you will be doing with it.
Yeah, you.
I think obviously we are asking for that information, so obviously we can monitor our applications coming forward to see whether or not in the AMR we have to obviously monitor the effectiveness of the policies. So obviously we are asking for that information so we can monitor that information to see obviously which direction we're moving in, and obviously we can also monitor those policies, those proposals that obviously don't meet the policy and what reasons why.
Okay, and is that going to be effective? Have you got the have you got the I'm trying to say, have you got the staff? I don't mean that. I mean,
you mean the basic skills to basically do it.
Skills. Have you got the skills?
Yeah. Well, that's where basically our long-standing relationship with Tudors come forward. They've supported other local authorities with this training and development. There would need to be training and development for obviously officers, members, etc., and developers. We would do that, roll that out as part of this policy.
Okay, thank you. Now, I know that you've been waiting to give me your justification for why you've taken the route that you've taken, please. And we know that there's the route that you can take for the building regulation matrix, and you say, well, no, that's not going to work here. You don't have to repeat everything. You've actually done quite a full statement on this, but please give me the specific.
Yeah, we've written 3 pages of responses to this question, and I don't want to take you through all of it, but effectively the TER metric, it doesn't deliver the best outcomes for the community. It's not measurable, it's not verifiable, and it means it in use, and you can't compare between buildings. You know, the notional building is generated by a computer model, and you need to be a certain amount of carbon emissions below it. It only captures a portion of the carbon footprint. It ignores energy uses from appliances, cooking and equipment. It aggregates elements of building fabric and ventilation and PV together. So it allows a lot of flexibility, which means you can compensate poor efficiency for bad fabric, which means there might be, occupants might be uncomfortable with renewables on the roof. It doesn't consider any impacts of good design. I think Adrian outlined at the beginning, especially in policy CN1, that the plan really wants to promote achieving its positive outcomes through good design, and that's exactly what space heating demand in EUI does, because it includes those elements of good design that don't get included when using TER. It's a very confusing metric for building designers. I mean, all building designers and the building industry, you know, using space heating demand in EUI means that you can build well-designed homes. It means it's easy to understand. You can then do it in a cost-effective way because you understand it. So it delivers on the outcomes of low energy and low bills in a much simpler, clearer way than TER. It's you know, there's no validating that the TER metric actually reduces energy consumption. There's a bit more in the document, but I don't want to go through all of it. So we've also got the fabric efficiency rate that building regulations uses, but it's got the same issues as the TER. Energy use intensity is much better. It's simple, it's easy to understand by everybody, includes all energy uses, and it can be used as a proxy for energy cost, which can be translated, which is a key consideration. It doesn't rely on these system conversion factors, which muddy the water and will change over time and may not keep things consistent. And it crucially includes this impact of building form, so that you can understand how energy efficient the building is. Space heating demand also includes the benefit of building form. It's used as a metric by the Climate Change Committee. It's used by Passive House as a metric. It's used by DESNZ, the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, for their social housing decarbonisation fund. So this is a metric that's very well understood and used by industry, just not currently in building regulations. I think it's also important to say that there's no conflict between the use of space heating demand and EUI with target emission rates. It's trying to do the same thing. It's just EUI and space heating demand does it in a much clearer way, so it's more cost effective for design teams to do it, and it can be monitored more clearly.
Okay, so I hear everything you say. So why isn't that the way that the government's doing it? Well, that's
so it's likely that the EUI will become used in future energy performance certificates. So it looks like the government are moving towards that in terms of EPCs. Why they're not moving towards it in terms of future home standard, I think
because we're still using we're using other metrics.
We're using different metrics. So, you know, you're aware of the local plans that have already adopted these metrics. Central Lincolnshire, Cornwall, Bath, tendering. Around 30 local authorities are also pursuing this. The GLA requires reporting of these metrics in planning applications. EUI limits are used in Department of Education in their briefs. So as part of their specifications, they require it. Ministry of Justice uses it in their specifications and briefs. Government Property Agency uses it. EUI targets are used by the NHS Net Zero Carbon Standard. So government uses it for their buildings. You know, it is the pilot version of the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. Uses these metrics. So there is a tide that's turning towards using these metrics for good design, to understand buildings, to keep things simple and clear, for design team, for contractors, and for consumers.
Okay, I get all of that. Yes, Mr. Barrett.
I suppose
Sorry, Mr. Barrett, would you mind putting your mic on? Yeah.
It is recognised that it isn't important to be promoted into that. And I think some of this relates to flexibility of achieving this, is that the council said you must achieve this level rather in terms of that, which then dictates how you then achieve it, rather than saying actually we want you to get to net zero, but we will give you the flexibility in terms of how you achieve it. In terms of that, it might be through obviously the fabric efficiency, which we'll get at, but maybe other mechanisms and the like. So I think it's potentially that's some of the reasons why I think within consultation response to the building regulations change, where I think it was promoted by others, by Letty and the like. So actually, it also includes energy use that isn't in the control of the developer. So in terms of those extra elements of energy use that actually that's beyond development can build to a certain standard and deliver that. it's then the use of that building isn't necessarily, and how it's used and the amount of energy that is used post construction isn't necessarily developed control. So I think there's those elements as well within that. I think if we do move towards that, then we may well move towards that. But I think that's for national policy in terms of regulations to set that out.
Yeah.
That's specifically set out in local plans. I think that's what the government's trying to do, is to give this transition to net zero through the future house standard. I think that's just what we would advocate, recognising that the council has a different view and others have different views in the
Okay, thank you.
You've just turned it on. You turned it
Oh,
on now.
sorry. I'm colourblind, red and green.
Okay, do you just
Oh.
one? Do you have anything else to say?
I suppose this is the only credible way that any industry body has said you can get to net zero for buildings. That there is no other way, right? That there's no credible way. The Future Home Standard says it's going to be ready for net zero. That's what it is. But by saying it doesn't mean that it is, right? I've done so much work. I've looked at carbon budgets. I've built an energy, like a model that has all the carbon emissions of whole of the UK in, and looked at pathways of how you get the UK to meet the carbon emissions that are legally binding, right? I built that for the net zero carbon building standard. The net zero carbon building standard has these same metric, has these targets. This is the way.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to leave that discussion there. Thank you very much. Let's move on. Now, could I just check, is everybody comfortable to continue? It's 20 to 5. I'd like to continue if everyone's comfortable doing that. Okay, water efficiency. So developments, basically what this is saying is it's setting a target that is higher than that prescribed in national policy effectively. So can you justify that to me? The target at the moment is 105. At present it's 105 per person in the extant local plan, isn't it? CP11. And what you say to me is there's a small difference, so it won't have much impact on cost, and the policy allows flexibility. So I know all of that. It says if it isn't feasible. So anything to say beyond that, please?
Thank you, Ma'am. It obviously originates with Southern Water's T100 target. Obviously, they are a statutory undertaker for water. So obviously they've done a lot of work on water efficiency, and obviously we want to bring in line with that, and obviously not forgetting that the southeast of England is in a water scarcity area, and any gardeners around the table will know how dry the gardens are at the moment. So that is obviously the basis of it. It's gone through the viability testing, and our viability consultant Dixon Cell Partnerships has said that 100 litres doesn't have an impact on terms of viability. Going beyond that does, but 100 litres per person per day is basically achievable within the viability work that we've done.
Because this is still in the realms of fittings, isn't it? If you're
a lot of it is to do with basically putting water efficiency measures in your house, and obviously other measures to basically reduce your water consumption.
Okay,
and with fuel poverty and obviously things, reducing people's energy bills has got to be a good thing.
Okay, and you say demonstrated it's not feasible. So what would that include?
I think that is just being pragmatic, that obviously that in some situations it might not be feasible. And again, it comes back to that point we were discussing on CN3. We don't want to put a list in the plan to say basically what would not be feasible, because in a way then you're inviting people to actually come up with reasons. But basically that's part of the planning judgment that will be taken at development management stage.
Okay, I understand that. Can I open it up to the table, please? There are people around the table who've got to be on this. Mr. Brent. Coast
Is
Builders
that,
Federation.
is that on? Sorry, so I just so I make sure. Yes, that is on.
There's a light on it.
It's
Oh, you can't always
it's red.
see
It's
it.
red and green, so I wasn't sure which, and
Ah.
I'm never sure which is green and which is red. So
If you look at
I
the
can hear
stem of the
myself. So I can.
microphone, this
Thank you very much.
is
Thank you very
illuminated when you're on.
you. You can't see that from head on. In terms of that, again, it comes down to that consistency with what's said in terms of PPG. Recognise that the council in terms of water stressed areas, it does in terms of say that it's within the water stressed areas is the reason for going down to 110 rather than going down to the 100. As it's being suggested, recognise that the Southern Water would like them to go further, but it isn't consistent with national policy in terms of that of what the technical standards are. It may well get there, it may well improve, but I think at the moment it's not consistent, and
Okay.
I agree against that. Thank you.
Would you like a discussion about the policy and legal aspects of consistency with national policy?
I'll leave that to you.
Recognising it's a material consideration.
Yeah. Okay. Do the council have any response? You've heard, I understand, two sides of the discussion, and I'll come to a view on that. Okay. Thank you. That's the nub of what I wanted to speak about in terms of. Okay. Covered everything I need to. Policy CN5 that deals with renewable and low carbon energy. So it supports renewable and low carbon energy schemes and sets out criteria against which they'll be assessed. And what you say is that it will ensure that schemes take place in the right places, basically. Yeah. And sets out criteria on what information the applicant needs to provide. I've got a note here. Can you explain criteria 6, please? Oh, that in the management plan, the measures that the scheme has incorporated for environmental, wildlife enhancement and nature-based solutions. So I didn't understand that criteria.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to say is basically how you're going to manage, obviously, kind of the environmental wildlife enhancements, because it's all very well putting them in, but what are you actually going to do to basically make sure, obviously, they deliver benefits? So basically, obviously, the management plan itself would basically identify how you're going to do it. What I should start by saying is, obviously, we reviewed basically the criteria in the adopted local plan for very similar policy, and we've taken on board basically kind of recent experience from appeals, and obviously requirements such as a restoration plan, things like that, emergency plan. So they are changes from the adopted local plan, but they've taken on good practice, if you can put it that way, in terms of what we've learned from appeal decisions that we've had. We've had quite a few renewable energy schemes in the district.
Okay. I'm going to leave that sorry, did you want to come in? Oh,
Can you
okay.
just give us one moment, please?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Just the point that I picked up is just, I've been reminded there's a main mod dealing with criterion 4. I mean, you don't need to tell me that necessarily. I'm simply, because it says at the moment as drafted, it says that there are no adverse impact.
Yeah.
Obviously, you can't have no adverse impact at all. So I think we simply add the word significant
in main modification 9, on page 10.
Okay, I see that. That was yeah, that was my concern. I was actually going to raise it again in relation to CN6. That's what I was going on to, because you make the same point there, don't you?
We do. It's exactly the same point there.
And
that's basically it. Well, sorry, do you want to move on to CN6? But it's CN6. We put not a significant impact on heritage.
It's actually a slightly different point in CN6. CN6 talks about unacceptable impact, as opposed to CN5, which was just
Yeah.
no adverse
Yeah,
impact
yeah.
at all. So
Yeah.
but we've suggested changing
Yeah.
it for consistency of language anyway.
Okay, okay. And okay, so I'm just scanning through my notes. Yeah, in relation to CN6, you say that it would encourage, so it supports microenergy generation schemes, doesn't it? Does it encourage them, or are you saying because there's a supportive
I think,
policy framework that it would
I
encourage
think it's
them?
the latter, the supportive policy framework.
Okay, I understand. Okay, I don't have any other questions on that. Does anybody else? No. So let's move on to CN7. Just explain, please introduce this policy and explain its purpose.
Thank you, Mum. What we're trying to do is recognise that obviously that there will be, as the plan obviously kind of goes over its lifetime, more and more demand for energy storage. We put forward a main modification, basically main modification 11, to actually clarify its community energy storage.
Okay.
Got a very good example that I know very well in Kingsworthy, where I live, where basically a scheme came forward, designed very well, but then basically by the car park was this basically large energy storage, which was kind of an afterthought. So what we're trying to do is basically say that basically for community energy storage, and we've again got a modification there under 100 kilowatts per hour, basically you've got to actually think about the design of it, because it actually spoils this particular development that I'm thinking about, because basically it's kind of just shoved in the corner and an afterthought. So hence why we thought it was a good idea to basically think about this and have a policy on it, to be basically supportive of it, but obviously have the criteria that need to be addressed.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't have any further comments on that policy. Does anybody else wish to say anything? Okay, let's move on to policy CN8. Sorry. Right, so the policy requires major residential and non-residential development to calculate and supply information on the outcome of an embodied carbon assessment. And much like CN1, you've in your Appendix 1, you've provided more information on what should be provided for that. So all those questions that I had on what stage would it be required, etc., that's actually within that document, isn't it? So does anybody have any comment on that? Councillor Lee?
Yeah, thank you. Forgive me, Appendix 1 I haven't studied in detail. I just want to clarify. Obviously, CN8 has policy merit for all the reasons we've been talking about, but I wonder if it falls short, merely prioritising data collection without a clear implementation pathway or target for how it helps. I just wonder, have we clarified that? And without guidance or benchmarks, how will the data drive reductions? And picking up on what was said earlier about the 2025 future home standards, which of course is a significant step, but we don't have the detail, I think is what Clara Sepp mentioned. So there's obviously going to be a gap between what is happening at the moment, improving building standards. Embodied carbon now accounts for more between 20 and 50% of the total carbon footprint of new buildings. So clearly this is important. So my suggestions are to make this more sound and effective. I wonder whether we should be including more well-established frameworks, not just the RICS, LETI, maybe UK Green Building Council. Reference would improve clarity, maybe alignment with industry best practice. Obviously, including in the energy and carbon statement is welcomed. But I do wonder whether it should be clear that a percentage of whole life emissions should be clearly stated in terms of what embodied carbon contributes. And then should we be setting an incremental increasing embodied carbon target to set across the period of the plan? And I just wonder whether that is something worthy of consideration. I think those are my main points, and clearly it's important that we align with net zero goals. We tackle both operational and embodied carbon. Thank you.
Okay, you've picked up on a lot of points that I was going to pick up on. Could I ask council to respond, please?
Yeah. I think, I definitely see the value in benchmark so that council can understand how the proposals coming forward compare to benchmark good practice, and that would all be set out in the kind of technical advice notes that would go as part of this policy, right? So embodied carbon assessments, they're relatively new. It's an area of fast-paced change, and the process of carrying out an assessment in itself, and we are asking people to reduce as best they can as part of the assessment, does really affect the embodied carbon of a scheme and reduces embodied carbon. The council had to make a decision on how far to push various policies as part of the plan, and it was decided that that's where we would stop here for this plan. We think it's really important the embodied carbon is included and measured and understood and assessed and reduced. Do also remember this plan was put together a few years ago, and because of such fast-paced change, if we were putting together a plan now, we might do something different. There'd be lots of other evidence we could draw upon, right? But we haven't. We're doing it, within the context of when this plan was developed. I think it's a justified level of progressiveness.
I think if I could also add, obviously, the trouble is it's the evidence base to actually put a percentage or thing, and other local plans have gone that far, and we haven't got that evidence base. What we're trying to do is basically, again, bring it back to the design process to say, think about embodied carbon. It is important. And basically, we want to raise it on people's radar that basically is important, and it's a key requirement that you need to consider as part of that process. And then, like I say, maybe for the next local plan, we will have some evidence basically to actually put kind of specific kind of figures in there, but we haven't got that information, so we can't go that far. We can't use obviously information from other local plans because obviously their build costs, etc., are totally different to ours.
And just to further add, collecting data in this local plan can then help inform the evidence base of the next local plan, as well as all the evidence created by industry.
Okay, that was that was something I was thinking about. What are you going to do? Again, what are you going to do with this data when you're collecting it?
Well, I think that comes back to obviously we're obviously committed to a local plan review. And obviously, depending how much data we've got and the timing of that, hopefully then in the next local plan, we can obviously put some specific kind of figures in it. But I wouldn't want to put those figures in now because I haven't got that data.
Okay. Sorry, can I just refer you to my question 2? Given the requirement for information on materials and construction methods, at what stage would an embodied carbon assessment be required?
Yeah, so we've put that information in the energy and carbon in the appendix 1.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't be in pre-app and outline, we would be expecting that applicants are committing to carrying out that assessment, and then at outline, at full planning application, then we would be expecting that assessment is carried out.
Yeah. Okay.
Ma'am, I wonder if I may just ask a question. It seems to me that, and I think Mr. Fox is right, the evidence is not quite there, but there's sufficient databases, ICE or EPD UK registries, embodied carbon in construction calculators, which surely must mean we should be able to create a notional benchmark of some sort for a range of buildings which might lend itself to what we're trying to achieve. In other words, try and get ahead of the game rather than wait another 3 years before we update the next local plan and then, the world's moved on. Just a thought.
Is it okay to respond?
Sorry. Yes, please.
And that's why I said, in the technical advice note, it'd be useful to have benchmarks. You know, we don't need to develop the benchmarks ourselves because, you know, in the last 2 years, Net Zero Carbon Building Standard has developed various benchmarks. Other evidence bases have been published and in the public domain that has benchmarks, right? So we can say this is what we'd expect from benchmarks, so people can compare themselves to it. And I think that will really help reduce embodied carbon. If we were to set hard and fast targets, right, then we would need to do a cost evidence base against those, taking into consideration a Winchester-based context. And we weren't at that stage because a few years ago, when this was being developed, there wasn't that evidence base, there wasn't those targets, and yeah, so that's why we are where we are.
Okay. Could I just refer you to my last question there? Could I have a comment from you on that? Concerns regarding the amount and quality of data across the construction industry on embodied carbon.
Yeah. So a lot of work has been done on this in the last few years. So the RICS methodology that's referenced in the document was first published in 2017, but it could be interpreted quite loosely, which is why I think now in 2023 it was updated. I was part of the authoring team for that to close some gaps so that it was clear what the methodology was. Right. We've also got a lot of, you know, because embodied carbon assessments have come forward in other local plans like the GLA for referable schemes, and it's now coming forward in lots of briefs. As is mentioned, you know, embodied carbon is a large proportion. As we reduce our energy consumption, embodied carbon becomes a larger proportion of carbon. So people have been really starting to care about it, which is great. And because of that, you know, the market responds. We've got lots of different tools. We've got lots of different databases that feed into those tools. So it's a reasonably simple process of developing an embodied carbon assessment, right? You know, at planning stage, you have a cost assessment, which is based on quantities of material, and you just create a corresponding embodied carbon assessment, which just applies an embodied carbon rating, embodied carbon intensity for each of those materials. So it is all out there and it is all very much doable. And the RICS guidance tells you where to find those data sources.
Okay. Is there anything else anyone would like to say, Mr. Gagg?
Yes, on embodied carbon, I just wonder what the final figure is you're looking to collect. It could be kilotons of carbon, or it could be kilotons of carbon per volume of building, or it could be kilotons of carbon per square meter, or for each resident. And I think you probably need, it would be very interesting to think that through. I tend to think that buildings in Winchester are rather bigger than they are elsewhere. So you could have a very low embodied carbon, but actually per home, they could be quite high. So in a way, we need a bit more information on what you intend to achieve in order then to get the right sort of data in the right sort of shape to make subsequent policy decisions.
Is that in the guidance already?
Not in the guidance, and I agree that it would be welcomed and we can put that in. I imagine we would be going down the kind of industry conventions for what's normally done. RICS has so we've said in the policy you need to be aligned with RICS, and RICS has tables that you need to complete as part of it, which have units of carbon in it. So you need to complete it. It's total carbon per building and then total carbon per meter squared, both for upfront carbon and life cycle carbon. So I didn't think it needed explicitly stating here because it's in the guidance that we're referring to, but hearing your words makes me think it doesn't harm putting it in the energy and carbon statement, so it's clear.
Okay. So are you suggesting a change to the policy there?
No. It's a change to the
guidance.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay then, is there anything else that anybody wishes to raise? Well, just left me to thank very much all the participants who've given their time today. Very much appreciated, and your contributions have been very helpful. So thank you very much. Council, we're up and running again at 10 o'clock tomorrow. We're doing that virtually. I would anticipate we have covered some of the matters on viability this afternoon, because I wanted to do that while I had the participants here, because I know that a lot of you aren't attending tomorrow. So I wouldn't anticipate those sessions being very long.
Are you going to have
Probably no. Probably let's just, we'll see how long it goes, but we'll have time for a cup of coffee and then, or a cup of tea, and then come back. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. It's, oh, look at that, just a couple of minutes past 5. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Well.